All right, today's lecture is going to be about natural disturbances, and I think it's really important for us to think about the natural processes that have shaped communities across the landscape, and we're going to talk about a lot of the management practices that we implement and how those relate to these natural disturbances later on in some of these other lectures when we're talking about habitat management tools and how we use them. So keep that in mind while we're going through this lecture material, that we will link these to the activities that we implement on purpose. So what is a disturbance? Think about that for a minute. How would you actually define disturbance if someone were to ask you? The best definition that has been articulated in the literature is this one here. So any relatively discrete event in time, all right, so it happens very quickly in a small amount of time, and it disrupts a process, right, whether it be ecosystem level, community, or related to the structure of the population that is there. It changes resources, substrate availability, or the physical environment. So this is a pretty broad definition of disturbance that encapsulates all of the different kinds of things that we might expect to be a disturbance. So if you're thinking about this from the point of view of succession, remember we have a stable state that is that climax community, right? Like if we have a plant community in a given area, we will see this directional, predictable process of change until we reach that climax community. So think about a disturbance is any event that would move it away from that climax community or disrupt that climax community from being, right? So if we had a hurricane, for instance, that comes through and completely clears a stand down to bare soil again, that would be a pretty intense disturbance that has reverted succession all the way back to the beginning, which we would call secondary succession in that case, remember from the last lecture. So that's a good way to think about disturbance. So the question is, why are they important? You probably intuitively already have some idea of why that might be. In I like this depiction right here. It's from the Greater Yellowstone area. It's talking about the importance of fire in that system. So you have the kind of this crossroads, right, where you see no fire in the cycle or fire in the cycle. Notice no fire leads you completely into a different cycle, right? We would have that community transition into an alternative stable state. So because that the fire has been an important part of that ecosystem's processing, when fire is in the cycle and gets applied, you see this chain of events, which is being depicted here, before fire re-enters the cycle again, right? And if ever fire is interrupted from the system, that's when we see the shift to the alternative stable state. And unfortunately, particularly out west, you've probably been seeing on the news some of these catastrophic wildfires, and that actually is a symptom of this process being interrupted, at least in part. For our purposes, remember when we're talking about succession, and again, I wanted to show you this graph because it's really important for you to get this in your mind. Think about the species that you are interested as a wildlife manager in managing or promoting or discouraging in some cases. And you can think about where along the successional gradient do we want to be, and that can inform what kind of natural disturbances may have promoted that species, and also how you can mimic that through your actions as a manager. So I wanted to show you some natural disturbances. This one would be an example of primary succession, Okay, so we have a lava flow here. All these plants that are colonizing that lava had to come from somewhere else to do so. So we would call that a primary succession. That's one of the most common forms of primary succession. There are many abiotic natural disturbance agents like that. Here's a list of some of the ones that we really commonly think about. Here in Florida, fire and wind are certainly very important, but if you have ever been anywhere in the South when we had an ice storm, that can be a big time disturbance, right? Because our species are not well adapted to deal with ice. If we had an ice storm in Central and South Florida, it could be completely devastating in terms of reshaping all of those plant communities, right? They just can't handle that. So that's an important thing for you to think about. Many of these systems, like we have some systems that have been drought prone for eons, right? They've been the plants and animals associated with those systems are accustomed or well adapted to deal with drought. So when drought affects systems that is not that don't have that historical experience, we'll call it, in the suite of species in those communities don't have strong adaptations, that can be a catastrophic event in that system. That's actually one of the things that we're really worried about with climate change is, we're reorganizing some of these abiotic disturbance agents in systems that aren't well adapted or well equipped to deal with them. So a lot of people don't think about gravity or geomorphology, but when you get into really steep landscapes, like in mountains, especially out west, we'll see things like this that could be really important. So here's some pretty cool examples of some abiotic stressors. So this top right picture here, the blue are plants that have enough water. The red are actually drought stress plants. So I also put this in here with the picture below it. That's an iconic image from the Yellowstone fires. Really cool, or the greater Yellowstone area. But one thing that is underappreciated, I think, and you may not have even thought of yet, is often we have disturbances interacting with one another. Okay, so you may have a severe drought that has killed a lot of the plants on the side of this mountain, and not only that, they're now dry and dead material that is highly flammable, and if that caught on fire, then it could be a really high intensity, large scale fire, right? And if all of that plant material gets removed from that landscape, we may then see really strong problems with geomorphology, with mudslides and things associated with all of that soil that is no longer being held there by the plants. So these things can and usually do, especially when you get to really large scale things like this, they often go together. So the left side of this, we're just showing how the drought affected plants. That was a pretty cool experiment that was being done. I just thought it'd be interesting for you to see. But the green plants are much less flammable, obviously, than the dead plants that died from drought on the left side of that image. Another important thing for you to realize is, and I think I talked about it in the previous lecture, the intensity and several other factors play a role in how the same process is affecting the system. So this set of pictures here that you're looking at is from the Lonely Pine ecosystem. What we see in the top left is much more typical of what we would be trying to do with a prescribed burn. Notice that the smoke is all moving from right to left. So this fire is actually backing across the stand. The fire is moving against the wind. and we typically can maintain a much lower fire intensity and a slower rate of spread of the fire, and we can burn pretty safely in a system like this and not affect the overstory trees, right? We have plants in this system that are very well adapted not only to withstand that disturbance, but also to encourage it to occur. All right, so the bottom left two pictures, those are longleaf pines. They're in the grass stage. They are extremely flammable. They also have adaptations that are protecting that bud from fire when it comes through, and they handle fire really well. The picture in the middle with all the yellow grass standing, that is wiregrass that has bolted and gone to seed after it was burned, which is an adaptation of that plant. This stuff will literally burn in the rain. I know that for a fact because I have lit it on fire during the rain. Very well adapted to promote fire, and then when you have fire occur in the system during a warm time period of the year, i.e. a growing season fire generally, the wiregrass will respond to that by trying to flower and produce seed. So all of those are suites of adaptations. We even have some pines in some systems that have cones that are serotinous. They have a wax that is basically holding the umbos together in the seed end, protecting that seed, and the heat will make them release it. So we see all kinds of adaptations like that. Longleaf does not need fire to open it, but it's really interesting. The pine needles obviously are extremely flammable and help carry fire. The two primary plant species in the longleaf system that are driving the spread of fire are those longleaf needles and wiregrass when it is present. It's not present in all the longleaf. But even in this system, if we just shift things slightly and increase the intensity of fire, that's what you're looking at in the top right. And those are actually mature trees. This was a prescribed fire where the wind switched direction, so they were trying to back the fire across, and the wind switched direction and it became a head fire. And here you can see it got up into the canopy and it actually outright killed some mature pines. So even in that system, just changing the intensity of the same disturbance can change the outcome. And this probably happened naturally, right? In the system when fires were progressing, you'd have some areas where you have this really intense, and it essentially has opened up the canopy by killing some of the adult trees, and then we see plant species invade those. We have gap specialists of wildlife that might be associated with it. We have dead wood specialists of woodpeckers and a suite of wildlife species that might be associated with the dead wood. These were all parts of the same disturbance, right? But unique aspects of it that created unique habitat features that can be really important in that system for some species. In our systems, in Florida, we obviously are prone to having hurricanes. And not only does that affect our systems through wind, so you can see in the stand on the left here, a lot of the trees are broken off. We have an accumulation of fuel that often will lead to a series of wildfires associated with that really high biomass of dead fuel. In the bottom right, what do you think that is? Think about it for a second. It's actually associated with the hurricane. This is I-10 right here. So, we're several miles inland, and we have these trees that have all been damaged from it, and that's actually from salt, from the initial surge of the storm. We had salt damage on all these trees. This was in southern Mississippi as part of Katrina in 2005, I believe. So we've been talking about it on each slide, but a lot of these disturbances will go hand in hand with one another. Here's some pretty interesting examples from eruptions, and then we have the snow avalanche there. We, in the top right, have the good examples of gravity with that erosion there. The bottom right, that was actually my truck that I was mud riding in. I'm just kidding. This truck got engulfed by all this soil substrate eroding away. So all kinds of disturbances out there. As I talked about earlier, ice can be a really big disturbance agent, especially in the southeastern U.S., where the species are not well adapted to deal with it. This top right is just showing you a tree where that whole thing has been broken off. What do you think happens in a forest that has been interacting with ice in this way, and all these limbs are breaking off and all this, right? That basically in that forest could serve as the canopy disruption that allows a lot of sunlight to penetrate to the forest floor, which we're going to talk about quite a bit when we're using silvicultural practices through harvesting timber. So the bottom two pictures, you may not have been thinking about flooding, but in some systems and even some localized areas are associated with tributaries or rivers, flooding can be a fundamental part. Think about wetlands that are associated with some of our larger river systems. These are a fundamental part of the ecology of that system, and we have suites of wildlife species that are associated with those conditions. So let's switch gears a little bit. Here are some biological disturbance agents that can cause some of the same kinds of things that we have just seen, and sometimes not only do they interact with those other things going on in the system that are abiotic, but they can cause their own unique disturbances as well and have their own unique influences on the way the system functions and succeeds. So one that's pretty important down in our part of the world is the southern pine beetle and Ips beetle species. Those can be really important. This top left image right here is showing you a beetle spot in this forest where a whole bunch of trees have gotten killed in a small area, and not only do you have all that dead wood associated with it, but that's going to be a really high sunlight environment at the ground level, whereas if the disturbance had not have occurred, that would not be the case. We have a whole suite of bird species and other vertebrates and probably invertebrates that are associated with these kinds of canopy gaps. This is in the bottom left is actually showing you the heat signature of pathogens that are attacking this tree. If you have taken the wildlife ecology and management course with me and you read Aldo Leopold, he spent a fair amount of time in one of the chapters talking about the importance of pathogens in the forest landscape to create these unique habitat features for a suite of species. So just some cool technology showing you how we use that. Of course, herbivores and herbivory, removing plant biomass can be quite the disturbance in systems. I have been in many places. In fact, I took this picture in the bottom right in North Carolina where there was active forest management going on, and because the deer density was relatively high, they were eating literally all of the vegetation that they could reach, which for them is a little over a meter tall. So they certainly can change the way that the plant community is succeeding. Of course, humans are a pretty big disturbance agent. We're affecting most of the landscape. I like this picture. It really illustrates the scale of impact. This is just the night lights in the United States right here that you're looking at, but you can see this is probably even more dramatic now. If we had a newer image of this, we've had a pretty big effect on the way the system functions. So, we think about disturbances, or at least the general public tends to think about them as very negative things, but we have flooding, for instance, in these systems, and there are a suite of species that are really important in those systems that are associated with those. And we see, like waterfowl, for instance, they actually provide the mechanism for plants to move between wetlands. They disperse wetland specific species from wetland to wetland where they otherwise wouldn't have been able to do that. And we see in the south, a lot of our waterfowl species that are dependent on this water actually show up at the same time of the year when things are typically flooding to use those areas. So a lot of these things, the wildlife species adaptations are keyed in on recurring disturbances like this flooding. Here's another example from out west. This was a wildfire that moved through, and it seems like it's complete destruction, but this species of pine here is completely dependent on these stand replacing fires, and you can see all this regeneration in the understory of that pine species responding to it. It was a natural part of the system and how it functions, and there are a lot of adaptations associated with the species to promote that. Here's a pretty cool experiment that we did in a previous version of this class, and we got it published as a class, but showing you how these things are interacting with one another. If you look at the data here on the left side, this is data from the paper that we ended up publishing as a class. By the way, I always try to incorporate experiments into the class because I think they give you a really prime illustration of some important points, but they also allow us to explore areas of science that may not be very well developed. And even as part of this class, we'll talk about and actually execute a couple of experiments to really strengthen your understanding of research and the value of exploring data, but it'll also make some key points about how important wildlife are in the system and how it functions. So this is data showing you that when there's no deer and no fire, this is what the plant community looks like, and that the control on this bottom panel right here, you can see when you add the herbivore into the system, it sort of forces it to the left. You don't really need to know what that means other than they change. When we add fire, it tends to shift it to the right. You can see that third one. And then you have fire and herbivore interacting. So when we burn, we top kill plants, and those resprouting plants are really high quality. Well, when those resprouting plants have high quality, they attract and intensify the herbivore preference for that area, and that intensified herbivory, and even we'll see the herbivore change selection of plants within the community. You actually see this non-linear shift. And what I mean by that is, look, when you add the herbivore to the system, it goes left. When you add fire, it goes right. And then when you add them together, it goes much farther right. Okay? So the data on the top, the A and B panels, are just showing you the magnet effect that we have of fire. So the fact that the effect size is positive, or it's above that 0, means that the fire is strongly attracting the herbivore. So we see an intense attraction for that area. So this actually creates a unique disturbance in the system that causes a different successional path in the plant community than we would have gotten with either fire or the herbivore alone. So that's pretty cool, and definitely something that's important for us to all be thinking about when we're going through this course and when you're thinking about habitat management.